Hello, and welcome back to Dark Crimes Real.
In late June 1967, a quiet, terraced street in Easton, Bristol, closed its windows against the evening air. By morning, the stillness was broken inside number 58 Britannia Road. Louisa Dunne, a 75-year-old widow, lay dead in her own home. She had been attacked and silenced where she should have been safest. Officers worked the rooms in slow circles. A forced entry, signs of a struggle, a house that held more questions than answers. They photographed, bagged, and labeled. They carried away clothing and traces so small they could hardly be seen. No suspect emerged. The file thinned as the years thickened. The city moved on. The house changed hands. The evidence waited. Decades later, the case was lifted from storage. A skirt, sealed since 1967, was examined under modern light. The fabric gave up a profile. A name surfaced from a different life in a different time: Ryland Headley. He had been 34 when the crime was committed. He was 92 when a Bristol jury returned its verdict. The court described a predatory and pitiless assault. The sentence was life imprisonment, with a minimum term that made release a theory rather than a future. A long silence had ended, not with a confession, but with preserved fibers and patient science. To understand how this case stayed cold for almost 6 decades, and why the answer was always inside that front room, we begin with the woman at the center of it all. Louisa Dunne had lived her entire life within the rhythms of Bristol. Born in 1892, she had grown up through 2 world wars, married young, and was widowed by her 70s. By 1967, she lived alone in a small red brick house at 58 Britannia Road, Easton, a modest home, surrounded by tidy gardens and neighbors who knew her simply as Mrs. Dunne. Louisa's life was simple, predictable, and kind. Every morning she opened her curtains at 8, fed the sparrows outside her kitchen window, and walked to the corner shop for milk and bread. The shopkeeper remembered her as polite, never hurried, always smiling through her soft Bristol accent. Her only family lived elsewhere, but she was far from lonely. Neighbors often stopped for tea in her small sitting room, where the radio hummed and the smell of lavender drifted from her cushions. She was cautious, too, the kind of woman who locked her doors and checked them twice before bed. At 75, she was vulnerable, but never helpless. Her community looked out for her, and she looked out for them. She had no enemies, no debts, no reason for anyone to wish her harm. But hidden beneath the quiet of Easton, in the summer of 1967, another life moved in the same city. Ryland Headley, a 34-year-old man who drifted through Bristol's streets with a history of violence. Unknown to Louisa, his path would cross hers in the most brutal way imaginable. The contrast between them could not have been sharper. An elderly widow surrounded by trust, and a man already at war with decency. It was a collision of innocence and predation that would stain an entire generation of detectives. On the night of June 27, 1967, as the streets cooled and the houses darkened, Louisa followed her routine, checked the lock, drew her curtains, turned off the lamp. She could not have known that outside someone was watching her window. What happened next would turn an ordinary home into the center of one of Britain's coldest murder cases. It was the night of June 27, 1967, a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way. Easton was quiet, its narrow streets lined with terraced houses that all looked the same. Behind those doors, families slept under the soft hum of distant trains. But at number 58 Britannia Road, something terrible was unfolding. Sometime after midnight, a shadow crossed the garden path toward Louisa Dunne's home. There was no sign of forced entry on the front door, suggesting the intruder came through the rear window, a small pane of glass later found broken, with a faint palm print left behind. Neighbors would later say they heard nothing unusual that night. No scream, no cry for help, only the faint creak of floorboards, the kind that could belong to any old house. Inside, the struggle was brief and violent. Louisa, small and frail, fought back with what strength she had. Furniture was shifted, a vase toppled. She was overpowered quickly. The attacker's intent was clear: a sexual assault followed by murder. By morning, the sun slipped through the curtains that she had drawn the night before. Milk bottles sat untouched on the doorstep. When a neighbor noticed Louisa hadn't appeared for her morning errand, concern replaced routine. Hours later, the police arrived. They found her lying in the sitting room, her clothes torn, her body bearing signs of both rape and strangulation. Nothing of value had been stolen. The motive was not theft, but violence. Officers dusted for prints, took photographs, and sealed evidence in small paper envelopes marked Exhibit 67/LD. At the time, forensic science could do little more than preserve what it could not yet read. No one could imagine that the tiny biological traces collected that day, fragments of skin cells, cloth fibers, a partial palm print, would outlive the man who left them. The press descended on Easton within hours. "Elderly widow murdered in own home," the headlines read. Bristol was horrified. Who could do such a thing to a harmless pensioner? Despite days of questioning and patrols, no suspect emerged. The killer had vanished into the ordinary city he came from, leaving behind only silence and a locked door. It would take nearly 6 decades before that silence was broken. It was June 28, 1967, when Louisa Dunne's routine finally betrayed her absence. Each morning she was seen walking to the corner shop before 9. That day she did not appear. Her milk bottles, 2 of them, stood untouched on the doorstep. By mid-afternoon, a worried neighbor crossed the garden and knocked. No answer. She called the police. Officers forced entry through the front door. Inside, the house was still. The curtains were drawn. The clock on the mantelpiece had stopped at 2:17 a.m. In the sitting room, they found her, collapsed on the carpet near the armchair where she usually read in the evenings. Her body showed clear signs of assault and strangulation. A single broken window at the back of the house suggested where the intruder had entered. A vase was overturned. Nothing of value was missing. It wasn't a robbery. It was personal, brutal, and senseless. Neighbors stood on the pavement, whispering in disbelief as the coroner's van took her away. Many of them had known Louisa for years, a gentlewoman, quiet, harmless. The idea that anyone would attack her in her own home felt impossible. By nightfall, the street was cordoned off. Detectives worked by lamplight, brushing for fingerprints and bagging every piece of clothing as potential evidence. Samples were taken from beneath her fingernails, from the torn fabric of her skirt, from the doorknob, and from the broken window. In 1967, there was no DNA testing, no databases, no computerized search. The evidence was cataloged by hand, boxed, and stored in a Bristol police warehouse, just another open file in a city that would soon have many. The story led the evening papers. Pensioner murdered in home horror. Reporters camped outside Britannia Road for days, but when the funeral came, only silence followed. The police had no suspect, no motive, and no traceable prints. The trail went cold almost immediately. For more than half a century, that house changed owners, the neighborhood changed faces, and the file labeled Dunne, Louisa, Homicide, 1967, gathered dust. But in 2023, a detective reviewing old evidence boxes came across something remarkable. A sealed paper bag marked Skirt, Exhibit 67/LD. Inside lay a forgotten fragment of truth that had waited 56 years to be heard. For more than 5 decades, the murder of Louisa Dunne sat in the archives of Avon and Somerset Police, a case file yellowed with age, its handwriting fading into history. Detectives had come and gone, generations had retired, but someone always kept the box. Inside were a handful of sealed envelopes, each labeled Exhibit 67/LD. In 2023, during a review of unsolved cases, a young forensic specialist opened one of those envelopes. Inside was Louisa's skirt, carefully folded and preserved. For years, it had been too fragile to test and too old for the science of the time. Now, with new DNA extraction technology, investigators could search for a genetic fingerprint invisible to everyone in 1967. The fabric yielded results. Microscopic traces, barely enough to see, produced a full DNA profile. When it was run through the national database, it matched a man named Ryland Headley. Headley had lived in Bristol at the time of the murder. He was 34 years old in 1967, young, strong, and already known to police for violent and sexual offenses. He had spent years moving between jobs and addresses, his name disappearing into minor records, but his DNA was stored decades later after another unrelated conviction in the late 1970s. That old sample became the bridge between 1967 and 2023. Detectives quietly reopened the case. They traced Headley, now living in Birmingham, a frail man of 91. His life had shrunk to routine, a small flat, medical visits, few friends. When officers arrived at his door in November 2024, he was stunned to see them. The charge, they told him, was rape and murder, committed 57 years earlier. During questioning, he denied ever knowing Louisa Dunne, but the DNA told a story that couldn't be rewritten. The chance of the sample belonging to anyone else was 1 in a billion. In June 2025, the case finally reached Bristol Crown Court. Inside, jurors listened to a crime older than any of them. The prosecutor described how Headley had entered the house through the back window, attacked Louisa in her sitting room, and left her to die. The defense argued that time had eroded truth, that evidence decades old could not be trusted. The courtroom was silent when the verdict came. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury found Ryland Headley guilty of both rape and murder. He was 92 years old when he stood to hear his sentence. The courtroom in Bristol Crown Court was packed on the morning of June 30th, 2025. Reporters filled the benches, their notebooks open beside grainy photographs from 1967. Black and white images of a street long since changed, a face long since buried. At the center sat Ryland Headley, stooped and pale, the oldest man ever tried for murder in the United Kingdom. The prosecutor spoke first, his voice steady. This was not a random act of madness. It was a calculated assault against a woman who could not defend herself. The evidence has waited 58 years to speak, and now it has. Over several days, jurors heard the story unfold from both sides. How Headley's DNA was lifted from Louisa's skirt, how a palm print matched the one taken from the broken window frame, how his past convictions for sexual violence revealed a pattern that time had not erased. The defense argued frailty, memory, and age. They said Headley was too old to stand trial, that evidence kept for decades could be contaminated. But science was firm. The match was exact. When the judge, Mr. Justice Saini, asked Headley if he had anything to say before sentencing, the old man shook his head. He whispered only, "I don't remember." The verdict came that afternoon. Guilty on both counts, rape and murder. Gasps filled the courtroom. Some wept quietly. The judge called the crime a cruel and predatory attack upon a defenseless woman in her own home. He sentenced Headley to life imprisonment, setting a minimum term of 20 years, but everyone in the room knew he would never see freedom again. Headley was led away in silence, his steps slow, the echo of his cuffs against the floor the only sound. For the detectives who had carried the case through decades, it was the closing of a circle, the end of one of Britain's longest-running murder investigations. As the judge rose, he said one final line that lingered in every reporter's notebook: "Justice has no expiry date." When the sentence was read, a strange quiet settled over Bristol. It had been 58 years since Louisa Dunne's death, longer than the lifetime of most who covered the trial. But at last her name had been spoken not as a mystery, but as a woman who finally received justice. Outside Bristol Crown Court, retired detectives stood shoulder to shoulder with the new forensic team. Some had joined the police long after the case went cold, yet all of them called it the one that never left the room. For months afterward, the Avon and Somerset Police Headquarters displayed Louisa's photograph on their memorial board with a single caption: "Justice delayed, but not denied." The discovery reshaped how British investigators viewed cold cases. It proved that no file was ever truly closed, that the science of tomorrow could still speak for the victims of yesterday. In the months following Headley's conviction, dozens of unsolved cases were reopened nationwide, their evidence re-examined through the same lens that brought Louisa's killer to light. Headley himself was transferred to a high-security medical unit to serve his sentence. At 92, he became Britain's oldest convicted murderer. The press noted the irony that time, which had once protected him, had also trapped him. He would die in the same country that had waited nearly 6 decades to hear his guilt confirmed. For the community in Easton, the house at 58 Britannia Road was no longer a headline. It was simply a home again. But the story endured, a reminder that evil can wait quietly, that justice can move slowly, and that even after half a century, truth has its own kind of memory. The murder of Louisa Dunne is more than a solved case. It is a testament to patience, science, and the human will to remember. For nearly 6 decades, a 75-year-old widow's death remained unsolved, her file gathering dust while the world changed around it. Yet a single fragment of cloth, sealed in an evidence bag, carried her voice through time. When Ryland Headley was finally convicted in 2025, it wasn't just a victory for the police or the courts. It was a quiet vindication for every detective who refused to forget, for every family that ever wondered whether justice can still come after a lifetime. Headley will die in prison, and Louisa's name will live far longer than his. Cold cases remind us that truth may sleep, but it never dies. Thank you for watching and listening to Dark Crimes Real. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe and remember, The past always leaves traces.